Few animated films have left audiences with emotional scars quite like The Last Unicorn. Released in 1982, the film initially appeared to be another family-friendly fantasy arriving during the golden age of animated storytelling. It featured talking animals, colorful landscapes, memorable songs by the band America, and an enchanting fairy tale aesthetic. Parents rented it expecting something comparable to Disney's classics. Instead, children were confronted with existential dread, mortality, alcoholism, lost dreams, cosmic loneliness, and one of the most terrifying monsters ever animated. For many who grew up during the 1980s and early 1990s, The Last Unicorn wasn't simply another fantasy movie. It became an unforgettable emotional experience that lingered long after the credits rolled. Its ability to traumatize wasn't the result of graphic violence or horror. It stemmed from something far more powerful, the realization that innocence itself is fragile. Unlike many animated films of its era, The Last Unicorn never assumed children required simplified storytelling. Adapted from Peter S. Beagle's acclaimed 1968 novel, the film retained much of the book's poetic dialogue and philosophical themes. Characters didn't simply explain their motivations, they reflected on life, regret, aging, destiny, and identity. The story opens with the unicorn living alone in an enchanted forest, believing herself to be the last of her kind. When she overhears hunters discussing the disappearance of unicorns, she embarks on a journey to discover what happened to the rest of her species. The premise immediately establishes an unsettling emotional foundation. This isn't a quest to save the kingdom. It's a search for an entire race that may already be extinct. That concept alone introduces children to the idea of irreversible loss. Unlike many fantasy heroes, the unicorn cannot simply defeat evil and restore the world to its previous state. Even before the adventure truly begins, something precious has already been lost. Every generation has its defining childhood monster. For many viewers raised in the 1980s, that monster was the Red Bull. Towering over landscapes like an unstoppable force of nature, the Red Bull barely speaks throughout the film. It doesn't need to. Its blazing eyes, infernal roar, and relentless pursuit create a feeling of inevitable doom rarely seen in family animation. Unlike villains who monologue or reveal elaborate plans, the Red Bull functions almost like death itself. It cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be distracted. It simply keeps coming. Its design amplifies this terror. Massive horns, burning crimson skin, and overwhelming physical presence transform it into an embodiment of primal fear. Even adults often describe feeling anxious whenever it appeared on screen. More importantly, the Red Bull represents inevitability. You cannot fight time. You cannot outrun mortality. Eventually, everything beautiful must confront forces beyond its control. That symbolic weight explains why the creature remains so memorable decades later. If the Red Bull represents fear, then King Haggard embodies despair. Unlike traditional fantasy villains driven by conquest or revenge, Haggard rules because nothing else brings him happiness. He possesses wealth. He commands armies. He owns a magnificent castle overlooking the sea. Yet none of it matters. The only thing capable of making him feel alive is imprisoning unicorns beneath the ocean, where he can briefly admire their beauty before sinking back into emptiness. This motivation was astonishingly mature for an animated antagonist. Haggard isn't evil because he enjoys cruelty. He's emotionally hollow. Children watching the film may not fully understand depression or existential emptiness, but they instinctively recognize something deeply unsettling about him. Adults returning to the film often discover that Haggard is even more tragic than they remembered. Perhaps the film's greatest emotional achievement occurs when the unicorn is transformed into Lady Amalthea. Most fantasy stories treat becoming human as an upgrade. The Last Unicorn treats it as a catastrophe. For the first time, the unicorn experiences fear, love, aging, uncertainty, and emotional vulnerability. She begins forgetting what it felt like to be immortal. She starts accepting mortality as normal. This gradual loss of identity becomes one of the film's most heartbreaking themes. Children may see a magical transformation. Adults recognize something far more devastating. Growing up. The unicorn's struggle reflects the universal experience of losing innocence, not all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the person you once were feels like someone else entirely. Many animated side characters exist solely for comic relief. Not here. Schmendrick is a failed magician who has lived for decades without mastering his craft. He survives through deception, improvisation, and stubborn hope. His greatest fear isn't failure. It's remaining mediocre forever. Meanwhile, Molly Grew delivers one of fantasy's most emotionally devastating moments when she encounters the unicorn. Rather than expressing joy, she breaks down. Her famous lament centers on a painful realization: the unicorn arrived too late. She spent her youth believing in magic. Now she's older, tired, and convinced those dreams abandoned her. When magic finally appears, she no longer feels worthy of it. For many viewers, Molly's grief becomes more relatable with age. What seemed confusing as a child becomes heartbreaking as an adult. One reason The Last Unicorn leaves such a lasting impression is its refusal to separate beauty from sadness. Its lush forests, shimmering castles, and ethereal animation constantly coexist with themes of extinction, regret, loneliness, and death. Composer Jimmy Webb's haunting songs reinforce this emotional contradiction. The soundtrack doesn't celebrate adventure. It mourns disappearing wonder. Even moments of triumph carry bittersweet undertones. Victory never completely erases loss. Magic always demands sacrifice. The result feels closer to ancient mythology than conventional children's entertainment. The phrase childhood trauma is often used humorously online to describe frightening scenes from older animated films. But The Last Unicorn deserves a more thoughtful distinction. It didn't traumatize audiences simply because it was scary. It challenged them emotionally before they possessed the vocabulary to understand what they were feeling. The Red Bull introduced the terror of inevitability. King Haggard embodied existential emptiness. Lady Amalthea revealed the pain of growing older. Molly Grew mourned the loss of youthful dreams. Together, these characters transformed what could have been a simple fairy tale into something far more enduring. A meditation on what it means to lose innocence while still believing that beauty is worth protecting. More than 4 decades after its release, The Last Unicorn remains proof that the most unforgettable animated films are not the ones that shield children from difficult emotions. They are the ones that trust them enough to experience those emotions honestly. That is why so many viewers remember The Last Unicorn not merely as a beloved fantasy, but as the first story that quietly taught them growing up would always come with a measure of heartbreak.